Okay.
But no, I wouldn't say history overwhelms me. Other things overwhelm me, but not history, no. Because I think if you're not careful, history can be a real weight and an anchor around you.
Prince William did not hesitate when the final document was placed before him. Yet the room around him seemed to hold its breath, as if it already knew the weight of what was about to change. A sealed chapter of the monarchy is suddenly reopened when he authorizes an unprecedented decision that sends shockwaves through the palace corridors. The private letters of the late Queen, long preserved under strict protection, are officially granted into Catherine's exclusive authority. Within hours, silence falls over Windsor, as courtiers realize this is not ceremony, but control shifting hands in a way no one expected, not even those closest to the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine sat alone when the sealed file was delivered to her private study, her fingers not moving as the palace seal was broken in front of her. Charles remained distant from the process, yet his absence felt louder than presence. Because everyone understood the late Queen's private correspondence archive, the protected collection of deeply personal royal letters, was never meant to rest in a single set of hands. Again, William appeared moments later, his expression controlled, but something behind his eyes had already hardened into finality. Courtiers outside the corridor spoke in lowered voices, because tradition dictated shared custodianship, a system designed to prevent any one royal from holding absolute interpretive control over sensitive royal records. Yet here it was, rewritten in silence. Catherine did not celebrate. She did not question. She simply closed the file, as if absorbing something too heavy to name. William watched her do it, and for a second, his composure cracked just enough for those closest to notice. The decision had not passed through the usual chain without friction. Senior staff had expected consultation, expected balance, expected delay. Instead, the authorization bypassed layers of archival oversight, the institutional framework that normally governs royal historical material and its protection. That absence of process became its own kind of alarm. Catherine felt it first when a junior aide avoided eye contact while placing the final copy on her desk, as if the document itself carried consequence beyond its ink. William's voice earlier that morning had been steady, almost clinical, but his refusal to explain further had left questions hanging in every corridor he walked through. Even Charles, reviewing the situation late in the evening, had paused longer than usual before closing the folder in front of him, saying nothing at all. Inside the administrative wing, suspicion began to form, not around what had been granted, but why it had been granted this way. A senior aide reviewing the authorization chain noticed something that did not belong there, a missing signature in the formal approval sequence, one that should have been present if procedure had been followed correctly. That absence was not just administrative, it suggested intention. Catherine was informed quietly, not through announcement, but through a whisper passed between staff who suddenly seemed unwilling to speak openly. William, when told, did not immediately respond, only looked down at the document in his hand, as if confirming something he already feared would be noticed. And in that silence, the palace understood this was no longer just about letters. It was about control, trust, and a decision that had already begun to reshape the monarchy from within. But behind the sealed document lies a deeper fracture inside the royal household, one that begins to surface through the people closest to the decision itself. William didn't raise his voice when the implications of the decision began to spread through the inner circle, but the weight of it was already shifting everything around him. The decision does not exist in isolation. It reshapes the emotional balance of the entire royal inner circle. Catherine stands at the center of an authority she never publicly sought, while Prince William carries the weight of having endorsed it without hesitation. Around them, senior courtiers, archivists, and even distant royal relatives begin to question what this shift means for trust, legacy, and control over the late Queen's most private written words. Nothing in the palace feels stable anymore, because even silence now feels like judgment. Catherine sat in the same chair she had used countless times for briefings, But this time, the paper in front of her carried something heavier than protocol. The sole custodianship of the late Queen's private correspondence, the protected collection of deeply personal royal letters meant to preserve her private thoughts and family reflections, now rested entirely with her. She read every line once, then again, and when she finished, she simply placed it down without speaking. William watched her closely, not as a future king assessing consequence, but as someone who already understood the cost of what he had approved. Around them, courtiers avoided eye contact, because trust in the traditional balance of access had just been rewritten in a single signature. Catherine did not celebrate it. She barely moved. But something in her silence made the room even more unsettled. Charles felt it long before anyone spoke it aloud. The king moved alone through a dim corridor later that night, holding a sealed copy of the authorization, reviewing it as if searching for something missing between the lines. His role in the monarchy's structure, the constitutional framework defining how authority and responsibility are shared within the crown, had always been to maintain continuity, not fracture it. Yet now he paused, staring at the document longer than expected, before slowly lowering it onto the desk. No words followed, only the sound of paper meeting wood. That silence carried more conflict than any public statement could. Inside the administrative wing, archivists began to feel the shift more sharply than anyone else. They understood what oversight meant, the institutional system designed to ensure royal, historical materials are reviewed, protected, and never controlled by a single individual. Now that balance felt threatened. Conversations stopped when William's name was mentioned. Some supported him quietly, believing Catherine's judgment could be trusted more than systems that had grown rigid over time. Others saw danger in concentration of access, especially when dealing with deeply personal, royal correspondence that shaped both public history and private memory. The divide was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Catherine's closest aide noticed her reaction shift later that evening when another file arrived. She opened it, scanned it once, and her expression tightened not in shock, but in recognition of weight. William, standing near the window, didn't ask what she had seen. He already knew the answer mattered less than the fact she had seen it at all. And somewhere deeper inside the archive chain, a quiet concern began to surface. One collection of letters might not just be personal history, but contain politically sensitive revelations capable of reshaping old assumptions about decisions made years ago, inside the monarchy. That thought did not spread loudly. It moved quietly, like a warning no one wanted to say out loud. And as questions build inside the palace, the origins of this decision trace back to a single moment no one has publicly acknowledged. William didn't call it a turning point when he made the request, but everyone involved would later realize that is exactly what it was. Long before the authority was granted, a single night inside Windsor's restricted archive changed everything. The late Queen's sealed vault, believed untouched for years, was opened after a confidential request from William himself. Inside, Catherine was present for the first time, witnessing documents that were never meant to leave archival silence. What she saw in those letters did not just inform a decision, it transformed it into necessity. Nothing felt symbolic anymore. It felt final. William stood outside the archive doors before they opened, speaking only once, his voice low but firm as he confirmed the access request. Catherine arrived without ceremony, brought in quietly, under conditions that required absolute discretion, because the late Queen's private vault, a restricted collection of personal correspondence and unpublished royal records preserved under strict security, was never meant to be observed. Outside controlled review protocols. Charles was not present, and that absence already reshaped the atmosphere before a single document was touched. Inside, William remained close enough to see everything, but distant enough to understand he was no longer just observing tradition, he was breaking it. Catherine moved carefully through the room, but her focus changed the moment the first sealed envelope was placed on the table. Catherine did not speak when she opened the first letter. She read it once, then again, and something in her posture shifted, as if the weight of the words had physically changed the air around her. William noticed immediately. He had seen her composed under pressure before. But this was different. The letter referenced internal family trust fractures, moments of private disagreement, and emotional distance within the royal household that were never meant to enter official awareness. Catherine stepped back from the table without saying a single word, her hand lowering slowly, as if she no longer trusted what she was holding. That silence mattered more than any reaction she could have given, because it confirmed what William had begun to suspect. These letters could not remain collectively controlled. William turned slightly, watching her carefully, and for the first time that night, his certainty began to shift. He had entered the archive believing oversight would be enough, that the system could still contain what was inside those sealed documents. But Catherine's reaction challenged that belief in a way no argument could. The king was informed only after the vault access had already taken place, his response arriving too late to change the sequence of events. When he finally reviewed the briefing, he said nothing immediately, only tightening his grip on the document as if weighing the consequences silently before releasing it again onto the desk. Inside the archive, tension grew heavier as another envelope was opened. A second letter appeared to reference a living royal in a way that raised immediate concern, not through accusation, but through implication, carefully written words that suggested unresolved decisions still echoing into the present. Catherine's eyes did not leave the page, but her expression hardened, as if she understood the scale of what this meant long before anyone else spoke it aloud. William finally closed the file in front of him, not because the review was complete, but because continuing would have changed something irreversible in real time. That single night becomes the turning point no one can undo, and it sets the stage for a confrontation that can no longer be avoided. William didn't raise his voice when he entered the room, but the silence that followed carried more weight than any argument ever could. Inside a private chamber, deep within the palace, the decision is no longer abstract. It is challenged face to face. A senior royal advisor confronts William over the authority granted to Catherine, questioning whether such power over the late Queen's private letters should ever rest with one person. What begins as protocol quickly becomes personal, as loyalty, trust, and legacy collide in a room where every word carries consequence. The advisor steps forward with controlled urgency, insisting that the late Queen's private letters, a protected archive of deeply personal royal correspondence, meant to preserve historical intent and family context, were never designed for single-person authority. William listens without interrupting, his expression fixed, but his silence is not agreement. It is restraint. Catherine is not in the room, yet every sentence feels directed toward her presence, as if she stands between them without physically being there. The advisor pushes harder, pointing out that Charles has already been described as deeply unsettled by the shift, a reaction that carries institutional weight because it signals uncertainty at the highest level of the monarchy. William finally responds, his voice calm but absolute, defending Catherine's role not as privilege, but as responsibility earned through trust no system could formalize. Tension tightens as the conversation turns sharper. The advisor warns that concentrating control over such sensitive material creates risk, especially when the letters contain references that could reshape historical understanding of past royal decisions. William does not deny the concern, but he does not retreat either. Instead, he anchors his position in conviction, stating that protection sometimes requires clarity, not diffusion. The room feels smaller with every exchange, as if the walls themselves are absorbing the conflict between tradition and choice. Charles is mentioned again, this time as someone reviewing internal reports late at night, visibly disturbed by the pace of decisions unfolding without wider consultation, a detail that deepens the unease already hanging in the air. The confrontation reaches its peak when the advisor lowers their voice, shifting from challenge to warning. Fear is no longer abstract, it is specific. If Catherine's authority leads her to fully open the archive, what she uncovers inside the late Queen's letters may not remain private history. It may become a reckoning. William finally stands at that moment, not in anger, but in finality. The chair behind him shifts slightly, the sound cutting through the tension like a sealed line being drawn. He ends the meeting without further explanation, signaling that the decision is no longer open for negotiation, discussion, or delay. As the advisor hesitates at the door, one last warning is spoken quietly, almost like a confession rather than a challenge. The palace may not be prepared for what Catherine will uncover. It is not said as threat, but as certainty built from understanding what those letters represent when removed from silence. William does not respond, but his stillness suggests he has already considered that possibility and chosen to proceed anyway. But the real force behind the decision is not confrontation, it is conviction, shaped by responsibility. Only William fully understands. William didn't speak when the door closed behind him, because there was no one left in the room who needed convincing. Behind closed doors, Prince William is seen alone, reviewing the authorization documents that now define a historic shift in royal control. No advisors, no interruptions, only silence and the weight of legacy. His decision is not framed as power, but as protection. For Catherine, for the crown, and for what remains of the late Queen's private truth, William believes the burden cannot remain in institutional hands any longer. William sits at the desk without moving for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the sealed correspondence guidelines, the formal set of rules governing access to private royal letters and archival material protected under strict confidentiality. He reads them slowly, not because he does not understand them, but because he is measuring what it means to step beyond them. The future king does not look like authority in this moment. He looks like pressure contained inside one human being. His restraint is visible in the way he holds the papers too still, as if any movement might fracture the decision already made. William exhales once, then continues reviewing the documents, aware that Catherine is now positioned at the center of something far larger than permission. She is no longer just receiving authority. She is being trusted to interpret the late Queen's intent through letters never meant for public framing. The Queen Consort Camilla, the King's wife who holds a ceremonial role supporting the monarch in public duties, is not part of this process, and that absence is quietly noted within the system itself. Charles is also absent from the final approval moment, a detail that lingers like a shadow over the paperwork, because his role as the king traditionally represents continuity between past and present authority. William's thoughts tighten as he considers Catherine's position. She is not just custodian of documents, she is becoming the emotional interpreter of history itself. That responsibility weighs heavier than title or structure, because it cannot be delegated or diluted. Advisors who reviewed the framework earlier had already expressed concern that William was moving beyond traditional royal boundaries, taking responsibility that normally sits within institutional oversight rather than personal trust. But William does not treat it as expansion of power. He treats it as removal of risk. In his mind, risk is not theoretical. It is what happens when truth remains locked without understanding. William finally leans back in the chair, still alone, still unmoved by noise or interruption. For the first time, the silence feels less like calm and more like anticipation. The palace outside continues its structured rhythm, but inside this room, decisions have already moved beyond discussion. Then his phone vibrates once on the desk, breaking the stillness without warning. A late-night message appears, brief and direct, suggesting that public awareness of the Frisian has begun to leak beyond controlled circles. William reads it without expression, but the tension in his hand tightens around the edge of the paper. And as control consolidates in private, the consequences begin to surface in unexpected and irreversible ways. William felt the change before anyone dared speak it aloud, because silence inside the palace never arrives by accident. The palace does not remain silent for long. Within hours of the decision becoming known internally, courtiers begin to shift positions, conversations halt mid-sentence, and trust fractures quietly across departments. Catherine feels the weight first, not through words, but through absence, as familiar voices suddenly fall silent around her. What was once protocol has now become perception, and perception inside the monarchy spreads faster than truth. Catherine walks through the corridor, expecting routine acknowledgements, but she gets something colder instead. A slight turn of heads. A pause that lasts too long. Courtiers begin avoiding direct discussion of her new authority, the sole custodianship of the late Queen's private correspondence, a protected archive of deeply personal royal letters, entrusted under strict confidentiality rules, meant to preserve family intent without public interpretation. Catherine notices it not as rejection, but as recalibration, as if the palace is quietly deciding how to see her all over again. William stands just a few steps away during a brief engagement, and when a question is raised about clarification, he refuses to elaborate further. His silence is not hesitation, it is finality. That finality spreads faster than any explanation could have. Charles moves through his evening alone, away from ceremony, away from public duty. The king is seen reviewing archival records late into the night, his focus fixed on documents that now feel heavier than their paper weight. The Royal Archive Oversight System, the structured framework that governs how historical, royal documents are preserved, accessed, and interpreted, sits at the center of his attention, not as a system to control, but as one that now feels uncertain in practice. He does not speak to anyone while reading. He simply turns pages slowly, pausing longer than necessary, as if trying to locate the exact moment when control started to shift without warning. Catherine stops walking in a hallway when conversation ahead of her ends abruptly. It is not loud, not dramatic, just instant silence, like a door closing without sound. She understands immediately what it means. No one tells her she is being watched differently. She feels it in the space around her. William passes by later and offers no reassurance, only a brief glance that carries more weight than explanation. Around them, internal fear begins to grow, not openly, but in fragments of thought shared behind closed doors. Some worry about exposure of sensitive royal family matters contained within the letters, especially references that could reshape how past decisions are publicly understood. Others fear something quieter but more dangerous, loss of control over interpretation itself. Then it appears without warning. An internal memo begins circulating through administrative channels, its language careful but sharp, questioning procedural legitimacy and whether the authorization process followed established royal oversight standards. No name is attached at first, but everyone understands what it implies. Catherine receives a mention of it indirectly, not through formal briefing, but through the way people suddenly stop speaking when she enters a room. William reads it once and does not react outwardly, but the tension in his silence deepens. Charles sees it later and sets the paper down without comment, as if acknowledging that the system itself is now under strain. But the most important shift is not institutional, it is personal, unfolding in a private exchange that changes everything. William didn't speak at first, because silence was the only thing that felt honest in the room. In a quiet, unguarded moment, away from advisors and formal protocol, William and Catherine meet without interruption. There are no titles in the room, only two people bound by trust and responsibility. Catherine finally speaks about the emotional weight of the letters, while William reveals why he could not entrust them to anyone else. What is shared in this exchange reshapes not just authority, but understanding between them. Catherine stands near the table, her voice lower than usual, carrying the strain she has been holding back since the archive was opened. The late Queen's private correspondence, a collection of deeply personal royal letters, preserved to protect private family truth and historical intent, now feels heavier in her memory than in her hands. She admits she has read more than she expected to, not as a custodian, but as someone trying to understand what cannot be unseen. William listens without interrupting, his expression steady, but his eyes reveal the cost of that honesty. He does not correct her, he does not soften it, he simply accepts it, because he already knows the weight she is describing. William finally speaks, and when he does, there is no institutional framing, no reference to duty or hierarchy. He explains that institutional control, the formal system of royal oversight, and administrative guardianship designed to regulate access and interpretation of royal materials, would have diluted what the late queen left behind. He believes the intent inside those letters would have been filtered, softened, or reshaped by structure, rather than understood in its raw form. Catherine looks at him closely as he says this, because she understands what he is really admitting. This was never about convenience or authority. It was about trust, placed outside tradition. Catherine lowers her gaze for a moment, and when she speaks again, her voice is quieter, but sharper with truth. She admits fear not of responsibility, but of exposure. The fear is not abstract. It is rooted in what those letters might mean if interpreted publicly without context, and how easily private truth can become public judgment inside the monarchy. William does not dismiss her fear. Instead, he steps slightly closer, not to pressure, but to steady the moment. He tells her that fear is not weakness here. It is proof that she understands what she is holding. That simple reassurance carries more weight than any formal approval ever could. For a brief moment, the distance between them disappears. Catherine realizes that William is not positioning her as a custodian in title, but as someone he genuinely trusts with interpretation itself. Their bond does not shift through ceremony or decree, it shifts through understanding. Catherine exhales slowly, and for the first time since the decision, her posture softens. William does not celebrate it. He simply remains present, as if knowing that anything more would break the fragile balance, forming between responsibility and emotion. Then Catherine pauses. Her eyes fall back to one page she had almost forgotten, and something changes in her expression. She realizes one letter references a decision tied to a living royal in a way that could alter public perception of the monarchy if ever understood outside its original context. The silence that follows is immediate and heavy, because both of them understand this is no longer just about private memory, it is about consequence waiting to surface. And once the truth of the letters begins to surface, the world outside the palace can no longer remain unaware. William didn't look away when the first alert appeared on the screen, because he already knew the moment had arrived. The story breaks beyond palace walls, and the reaction is immediate and intense. Headlines shift within minutes, framing Catherine's new authority as one of the most significant internal royal decisions in recent memory. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds begin gathering as journalists reinterpret every past royal archive controversy through this new revelation. The monarchy, once private in its decisions, now finds itself at the center of global speculation. A major newspaper front page dominates the morning circulation with one stark line: Catherine given control of late Queen's private letters. The late Queen's private correspondence, a protected archive of deeply personal royal letters preserved to safeguard intimate family history and constitutional intent. This suddenly no longer just a matter of internal trust. It becomes public debate. William stands in silence as the coverage expands, his expression unchanged even as the narrative around him begins to shift. Catherine, reading the same headline through a brief internal briefing summary, says nothing, but her stillness carries more weight than denial. Outside, crowds form near Buckingham Palace gates, not in protest, but in curiosity, holding phones high as they try to capture meaning from uncertainty. A broadcaster interrupts scheduled programming to describe the situation as a quiet transfer of historical guardianship inside the crown, referring to the informal but powerful control over royal historical materials and how they are interpreted for public understanding. That phrase spreads instantly, repeated across panels and online commentary, reshaping how the public sees what has happened. Catherine is now described in multiple media outlets as central to royal historical preservation, a role that feels larger than her title but smaller than explanation. William's decision is framed globally as decisive and unconventional, with analysts pointing out that he has placed personal trust above traditional institutional filtering systems. Charles, mentioned briefly in commentary, is portrayed as reserved but visibly distant from the unfolding narrative, a detail that deepens speculation about internal disagreement. Inside the palace, Catherine hears none of the broadcast noise directly, but she feels its presence in the way staff begin moving differently. Conversations shorten. Doors close faster. The shift is no longer theoretical, it is physical. William remains composed through each update, but his silence now carries the weight of interpretation he no longer controls. What was meant as internal trust has become external scrutiny, and that transition is irreversible. Advisors watch closely, aware that once the public frames a royal decision, even clarification cannot fully reshape perception. Then the tone outside changes again. Public attention shifts sharply toward what the letters may reveal about past royal decisions, not as speculation alone, but as expectation. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace grow denser as cameras capture every movement at the gates, turning stillness into narrative. Online discussions escalate, and commentary begins focusing less on authority and more on content, what Catherine now holds, and what it could mean for the monarchy's private history, if ever interpreted beyond its original context. But amid global reaction, the final meaning of this decision is only understood within the walls where it was made. William stood still long after the conversations ended, because he already knew this was the moment history would not forget. In the end, the decision does not fracture the monarchy, it redefines how trust operates within it. Prince William's choice to grant Catherine exclusive authority over the late Queen's private letters becomes less about power and more about confidence in judgment. For Catherine, it marks not elevation, but responsibility carried in silence. And for the royal family, it becomes a turning point where legacy is no longer guarded by institution alone, but by personal trust. The decision is ultimately framed as trust-based delegation, a shift where responsibility is placed not through traditional institutional restructuring, but through personal confidence between senior royals. Catherine receives that responsibility without ceremony, yet the weight of it is unmistakable. The late Queen's private correspondence, a protected archive of deeply personal royal letters, preserved to safeguard family intent and historical truth, now rests under her careful authority. Catherine does not celebrate it. She accepts it with quiet restraint, acknowledging internally what William has chosen for her without needing public validation. William remains firm in that choice, standing by it even as external pressure continues to grow, refusing any suggestion of reversal, because, for him, trust has already replaced hesitation. Catherine moves through her duties with a changed presence, but not a changed voice. She does not announce anything differently, yet everything around her feels recalibrated. William watches that transformation without interference, understanding that his decision was never about expanding control, but about protecting meaning from dilution. Charles, the monarch responsible for maintaining continuity and stability across the royal institution, acknowledges the shift privately in conversation, recorded later, through a documented internal account shared by a senior aide. He does not challenge it. He does not reverse it. He simply accepts its permanence, recognizing that some changes do not require approval to become reality once they are already in motion. Inside the palace, the monarchy adjusts without confrontation. There is no public correction, no institutional denial, no visible rupture. Instead, there is quiet adaptation. Courtiers reorganize their understanding of responsibility, archivists recalibrate access expectations, and advisors begin treating Catherine's role not as temporary authority, but as defined guardianship. That guardianship extends beyond documents, it extends into interpretation, because what she now holds is not just history, but emotional memory preserved in written form. Catherine's response remains controlled, but her silence carries certainty rather than hesitation. William never steps back from his decision, even as pressure lingers in the background, because for him the outcome has already proven its intent. The monarchy's final understanding of this moment settles slowly, without announcement or ceremony. Catherine's role becomes defined as guardian of sensitive historical truth, a position shaped not by inheritance alone, but by trust placed under extraordinary weight. The family does not describe it as change in structure, but as change in understanding how authority can exist when it is given, not taken. and how responsibility can belong to one person without weakening the whole. This moment is remembered not as controversy, but as a quiet redefinition of responsibility inside the crown, where authority was not taken, but entrusted, and where trust became stronger than tradition. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.